In this session, we'll briefly be talking about Livingstone's Chapter 8, Concepts of the Divine. The vast majority of the world's religions have some sort of notion, some sort of idea, some sort of teachings about the transcendent. Now, you have Buddhism, which is non-theistic, and so there's no particular teaching about a higher being, so to speak. That's not necessarily in their philosophy. So, but the vast majority of religions do have some sort of transcendent power, a divine presence, or a divine being. In this case, we have these pictures are taken from the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's paintings on top of the Sistine Chapel, and a very anthropomorphized understanding of the Christian God in this sense. But here you have God, in the top picture, is like touching life into Adam. And so in the pictures down below, you have, God like pulling Eve out of Adam's side, in recounting the Genesis story. But you have, in these religions, you have some sort of teaching or understanding, even if it's recognized that it's not correct. People, Christians don't necessarily think that God is an old man with a white and gray beard, but it's important for people to kind of have images of God and talk about the divine in relationship to themselves. We find a lot of stories and mythology about the gods, but the idea is that it's trying to convey meaning, trying to put things in perspective, answering questions of how did we get here, why are we here, and what's our relationship with that divine presence, with that transcendent. So that's what we'll be talking about in this session. And looking at the notions of the divine, you have two major relationships that can be considered. One is this idea of immanence versus transcendence. So now transcendence is in this image here. It's like where you have the divine or you have the God outside of the natural world, transcendent, not bound by the natural world, above and beyond the natural world. Where on the other hand, you have eminence, or God being eminent in, or the divine being eminent in and pervasive throughout the natural world. For example, you have Tyler's animism, where all things are animated by spirits, and these spirits, they're not above and beyond the natural world, but they're actually living. The spirits are living in the natural world, and so this divine presence is immanent throughout the natural world. So you can think of these like animism, polytheism, monotheism, henotheism, a lot of these notions of the divine, looking at them as this relationship between immanent and transcendence. Now, one of the interesting things about Christianity is, like here in Christianity and some other religious traditions, is you have this idea of God, of the transcendent God, kind of coming into the natural world and working in the natural world, but yet at the same time remaining transcendent. And so you have this combination, or trying to overcome this notion of immanence versus transcendent. Now the Jewish God was not necessarily immanent, but was transcendent. Well, what you had with Christ is God becomes human and works in the natural world and comes down. Now in the Old Testament, in the Torah, you do have the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You do have God, coming down and acting in the world. Not completely transcendent for Judaism, but with the New Testament, or with the Christian teaching of God becoming man, is God becoming immanent in the world. But a lot of these philosophies about the divine, have this relationship between immanence and transcendence. Here you have this image of God as transcendent, but also moving and becoming immanent and working in the natural world. The other major relationship is this idea of oneness versus plurality. In ancient Greek philosophy, when they're looking at the first Greek philosophers, Thales, for example, everything was made of water, different densities of water, but everything was water, and so it was called monism. This idea that everything was made up of the same substance. And some of his successors, material changed. Everything was made up of air. Everything was made up of the aperon. But you have this idea like everything is made up of the same substance, just in like say different densities or using different characteristics. But everything is one. Well, the same can be said about some notions of the divine. It's like that everything is one. We just see things differently. In Hinduism, everything is essentially Brahman. It's manifested in different ways, and we see it in different ways, but everything is essentially one. So now with polytheism, you have like everything is different gods, but there's this understanding of like, well, especially like in Hinduism. In Hinduism, it's like you have on the one hand you have the oneness and you have the plurality. You have a million different gods, but at the same time, everything is this one. It's this one Brahman. A lot of these ideas are trying to understand this difference or this relationship between oneness and plurality. So there's certainly a firm difference in Greek mythology, between the gods. But just a lot of these ideas of the divine can be looked at in the relationship between immanence and transcendence, and also between oneness versus plurality. And we'll look at a couple of examples in the next slide. This is going to be the major slide we'll focus on during this presentation. So it'd be good for you to look at this slide and remember this slide. So this is kind of I wouldn't say it's a progression as far as like a timeline or like a social evolution sort of theory, but progression as far as between the one and the plurality, like the one and the many, different ways of looking at the divine. And now remember, keep in mind this relationship between the oneness and the plurality, and also the immanence and the transcendence. Well, starting with animism, animism, going back to Tyler, is you have this idea of everything is animated by spirits. So you have many different spirits. Then it's not just one spirit. So you have the many. Yet at the same time, they're in the world. They're not outside and above the world. They're actually in the world. And now we have this, they had the notion, earliest anthropologists had this idea of how animism kind of moves into polytheism and eventually moves into monotheism. We don't necessarily adhere to like a social evolution of thought, but it can be understood as animism moving into polytheism. In polytheism you have you have many gods, and some examples from the books is you have the sky gods. Now these sky gods, or what could be called monarchical polytheism, where you actually have like a pecking order, a hierarchy within this polytheism. The sky gods are often withdrawn to the sky. They're not engaged in worldly affairs. So the worldly affairs is left to other lesser gods. And so this here is a move from immanence to transcendence. Okay, so you see these sky gods, they start becoming withdrawn and start becoming over and above and don't have any kind of contact, like a daily contact with the natural world. So this notion of sky gods is actually the lesser gods have contact with the natural world. This is an example of this monarchical polytheism. You also have an example of this. You have the female goddesses or the mother goddesses. Now these goddesses are more eminent than transcendent. And this could be one reason for their popularity. It's because they are actually involved in the world. And you can appeal to them because they have an involvement in the world. And the female goddesses and the mother goddesses, they look at women and look at women as this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And this is also found in vegetation. You have this idea of Mother Earth, which is based on, when these individuals looked at the female. And so kind of using that notion of the female and applying it to the goddess, just on a grander scale. The female goddess Isis, you may have come across some statues. She adored in both her role as a wife and mother, and called the Divine Mother. Sometimes, like in these goddesses, it's really interesting. You have like an ambivalence in these goddesses, where they're loving, they create, loving, but they also have the ability to destroy. They're matrons of suffering, but they demand blood sacrifice. They're chaste yet promiscuous. They're pregnant yet virginal. And so you have a lot of these interesting paradoxes wrapped up in a lot of these mother goddesses. Now, polytheism, you can say, I don't know if you arguing, like, again, not with social evolution, but moves into dualism. But you do have the development of dualism later on. And here you have this notion of the yin yang or the notion of the cosmic struggle. In dualism, you have two co-equal and co-eternal powers. Now, in some, like with the yin-yang, such as Taoism and Confucianism, these two powers are harmonious. Okay, these, like the light and the dark. You may recall, the yin-yang symbol, the white and the black, the white circle or the big circle, and it kind of looks like a little fishtail, or like a number 6 and a number 9, and they're kind of like together. Well, that's the idea. That's the yin yang. It's like it's two forces. One is found in the other. In Taoism, to conceive the world as balanced between two polar forces that are not antithetical to one another, and they're also not hostile to one another, but they're two opposing forces. So the light and the dark. But the dark is found in the light, and the light is found in the dark. The yin-yang, perpetual interplay between the negative, passive, dark, feminine yin, and the positive, active, light, masculine yang. And there's this like ceaseless transformation of nature. One moves into the other. Now you have other kinds of dualism where you have the two powers are in complete conflict with one another. Iranian Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, some of the early biblical writings, Gnosticism, for example. And so you have like a dualism where these gods, these powerful forces are in conflict, and there's a cosmic struggle. This can be thought of looking at, people look at the bipolar tendencies in the human being, and they want to find a way to account for evil in the world. So, well, how do you have evil in the world? It's like, well, you have an evil spirit, or you have an evil god. So this trying to create chaos. So you have these two equal powers, good light versus evil darkness. They're battling over things. You may even see this in some evangelical churches, and talking about, the presence of demons and the presence of the devil as actually having a real existence and a power over individuals. And that is, it's a monotheism, but it also has like some sort of dualistic tendencies, because you have the battle between good and evil of two actual beings, of trying to have the good and the evil kind of be manifested in the world. Now, Gnosticism is something traced back to, first see it in the early Christian church. And some of these Gnostic Gospels were discovered some were discovered in the 1940s, and others were discovered in 1975. But in these were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, even the Gospel of Judas. Well, in some of these teachings, and these were said to be teachings of Jesus, but they were not accepted as creedal when they were determining what are the Christian scriptures. These were left out, then later treated as heretical, because they were determined not to be the true teachings of Jesus. Well, in Gnosticism, the world was created by a demiurge who was inferior to the supreme being. And the human soul is linked to the supreme being, but is locked in the prison of the material body. The body or material is evil, and the mind is spirit is good. And so you have this kind of dualistic nature. It's like, we're imprisoned. Our souls, our minds are imprisoned in our bodies. One way to resolve the issue is through this idea of this secret knowledge or gnosis. And the teachings of Jesus, what they do is they unlock the key for this knowledge. So Jesus was, when they're looking at, you can be like, when you follow Jesus and you understand his teachings, the Gnostics see that as, you're not only being like Jesus or like God, you are being God. You are unlocking your potential to have and having unity with the divine, and actually melding into the divine. But the problem is you have to break yourself out of the prison of your body. There's also this notion of what's called Manichaeism. If any of you have studied St. Augustine had studied with the Manichees before converting to Christianity. But in Manichaeism, you have this idea that the world is ruled by two independent, eternally opposing powers, the light and the darkness. The light being the soul, and the darkness being matter. Now you can see a little bit of this impact of Gnosticism and Manichaeism on Christianity, because you have in the writings of Paul, you can see the notion of the body versus the soul, and you can see this dualism present in some of the writings of Paul. Now on the other side of the line, okay, so the bottom side of the line are more in lines with like the one, and the top side of the line is more dealing with the many, or the pluralism. So on the bottom, I talked about the monism, water, fire, logos, where the whole world is composed of the same thing. In pantheism, it's important to understand monism to be able to understand pantheism. Pantheism is often associated with monism. So pantheism teaches it's like all things are in some sense divine. Well, going back to monism, I mean, if you say that everything is made of the same substance, Thales said it's water, and Anaximander said it's their apiron. All things are made up of one substance, but in different densities. Well, if you say that one substance is divine, well, then you're moving into what's called pantheism. Now, with Hinduism, I mean, Hinduism is just really interesting because in Hinduism, you have polytheism, you have monism, you have pantheism. I mean, it's really kind of interesting. It'd be hard to classify Hinduism as one particular ism on this line. I have in my notes that Hinduism, it moves from polytheism to monism because of this idea of the Brahman. Then you have many gods, but the many gods make up this single reality. And the Brahman is the power that pervades and upholds the cosmos, in which all things live and have their being. All things are. All things have their existence, in that they participate in this Brahman. So verily, the whole world is Brahman. The human soul is a mode or phase of the Brahman. And so you do have, so the body and the soul are both Brahman, but in different phases. So at its root core, it's kind of like, it's kind of a monism, but at the same time, it can be seen as a pantheism. And so that's the interesting paradox in Hinduism, is you have this plurality in unity. Plurality in unity. There are many things, but they all participate fully in the Brahman. There are many souls, or Atman. There are many souls, or Atman, but one Brahman. For this, I have a quote here. True knowledge is achieved only when we realize that the self, the Atman, and Brahman are not distinct, that the soul is identical with the Brahman, which alone exists, timeless and eternal. Now, this is right up the line of monism, but it's a divine substance, and so maybe it's pantheism. So but also you have these elements of polytheism, because there are many gods, but these many gods, it's plurality in unity, but you have the many participating fully in the one. Now, moving along to henotheism, let's go to these early tribes in Israel in the Old Testament. They did not worship a universal creator God, but they worshiped a tribal God who was conceived as unique in power and authority. When you look at the Ten Commandments, you say, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." What that is presupposing is that there were other gods. There were other gods, other tribal gods. And each tribe had their own kind of god. Well, what henotheism is, henotheism refers to the religions that recognize the reality of many gods, but they worship and believe in the ascendancy of one God. So where monotheism teaches like there's only one God, but henotheism says, okay, well, there's many gods, but there's one all-powerful God, which is our God. That's essentially what the early Israelites in the Old Testament were arguing. In early Christianity or in Judaism, Yahweh was the primary God. The one God was above all the other tribal gods, and Yahweh revealed himself to Moses. You eventually have a movement from henotheism to monotheism, where this demand of honoring me moves into a belief that is the only God existing in the world. So you have this henotheism moving into a practical monotheism, and then finally a monotheism, where you have, Yahweh demands that his followers only worship him, and then finally you have it moving along. It's like, our God is the only God. Your gods are false gods and are not true gods. So that's how you have, henotheism moving into monotheism, and how you see how henotheism is crossing this line. It's crossing from the many found in henotheism, where they allow for the reality of other gods, into the one of the monotheism. Now, deism, I talked a little bit about deism at the beginning of the course. Here you had this notion that the world was instituted by a divine, but the divine, using the example of a watchmaker. So the watchmaker makes the watch and then just hands it off, and the watch just keeps ticking because of the actions of the watchmaker. Watchmaker, made the watch, and so it just goes off and it ticks. And the watchmaker no longer has any contact with the watch, but the watch keeps running. Well, that's this idea of the deistic God. The deistic God is not, it's not a personal God. It's not someone you necessarily pray to, but there's a God that sets the laws of nature in motion, kind of sets the world in motion, and just lets it run. You could say maybe Aristotle had this, the prime mover could be this kind of God, got things going and no longer had a personal stake in things. And when people argue that the United States was founded on Christian notions, and cite some of the founding fathers, well, I would have to disagree in saying, well, the founding fathers were, for the most part, deistic and not necessarily Christian. And so there are some similarities between deism and Christianity, but a lot of these founding fathers and what you would find like the Knights Templar or the Masons, they were deistic. They didn't really see Christ as being the son of this God, but a God puts everything in motion and the laws of nature, and puts and just then removes himself from and becomes transcendent, becomes completely outside, not an immanent God as like existing within the world, but a transcendent God. And there's also panentheism, and panentheism is just it's really interesting. Why don't you look at that in the text, and we'll talk about it down the line throughout this session. But again, focus on this line. The relationship between the transcendent and immanent, and also between the plural and the one, the many and the one. Well, if you look at Western monotheism today, here are just some characteristics of the deity found in Western monotheism. So that would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. On the one hand, you have one. Okay, I am who am. Okay, I am who am. There's one God. All the others are false gods. Then you also have this understanding of a personal God, of intervening in human affairs, not completely removed, as some of the earlier gods were, or not like the deist gods. Here's the difference between deism and monotheism. It's a Western monotheism that has this personal God. Transcendent, not like material things. It's not composed of certain material that we're aware of. Eternal, always was and always will be. There's an understanding of God being outside of time, not bound by time. A creator, or else what was here first? So, and this creativity is continuous. There's this understanding of contingency of human beings to being dependent upon the God. There's one image of God breathing life into creation, and so constantly upholding being. Without God, we wouldn't be here. Omniscient, all-knowing. Okay? Omnipotent, able to do all things. So now there is a constant question about, okay, what's this if God is all-knowing, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, then how do I have free will? And you have this this paradox of, it's like, well, if God knows what I'm going to do, then how do I have free will to do what I want to do? That would be for a different class, because that gets pretty complicated. But the basic is that God is outside of time while we're living in time. So our decisions are based on a timely progression, but God sees human life as a whole, as one. And so he knows what you're going to do because he sees the beginning, the end, and all the options in between available to you. And so it doesn't determine your life, but knows what you're going to do anyway. So, but that would be for a different course. Infinite. God is infinite, not limited, spatially or temporally. Okay. Immutable. Uncreated, not dependent on anything or anyone. So this understanding that God is uncreated. Okay, that's important, because if you go back to Aristotle's notion of the prime mover, essentially at some point in time, you got to get to an entity that put everything into motion, that was uncreated, or else you just keep infinitely keep going back and back. Well, so who created who? Who created that God? Who created that God? Who created God? So at some point in time, there needed to be a God that was uncreated. So you can argue with the logic of that, but that's the understanding in Western monotheism. And holiness. Okay, God does not need the world. God creates out of love. Okay, that's the idea. Is God does not need the world for his own, its own existence, but is creating out of love. God is good and loving. So these are just some characteristics of the deity in Western monotheism that will be important to know. There's some questions that come up about God that we may get to in future classes, talking about theodicy and talking about human suffering. If God is good and all things created are good, why do people suffer? So why do you think? Why do you think? If God is good and all things are created are good, why do people suffer? Why is there suffering in the world? How did God create the world? Out of what did he create the world? Did he create the world out of something? Out of nothing? And if out of nothing, what did he make that nothing from? And so I mean, these are just questions to grapple with. If God does not need us, or we have no impact on God, why are we here? And that answer, the characteristics of holiness. Well, God creates out of love. Could be an answer to this question. But just you can write some of your discussion answers as in answering these questions if you want to veer off a little bit. So and let me know if you have other questions in your discussion board posts. Do you have other questions about about the deity, and like questions that you've been grappling with that you haven't been able to answer about God, maybe God's goodness or about suffering? A lot of these questions come up. It's important to grapple with them. And I want to highlight some of the differences between deism and monotheism. I touched on some differences in the previous slide. But here you have, in deism, God created the world but no longer has any personal connection with the world. The world just runs along according to the natural laws instituted by God. So once God creates the world, he can let it go. Again, think of the watchmaker and the watch. Now you also have belief in God for the deists. Belief in God is rational and necessary because belief in the God is required to explain how the world works. Belief in God is required to explain how the world came into being. Belief in God is required to explain how beings are contingent upon a greater being. And belief in God explains the first mover, or what is sometimes called the cosmological proof of the existence of God. And that's what I noticed, well, at some point in time, take the Aristotelian argument, at some point in time, there had to have been a first mover that put everything into motion, that put all of the laws of nature into motion, put all of creation into motion. At some point, there had to have been a first mover, or else you just keep asking this question infinitely and becomes absurdity. But there's interesting, the belief in God is rational for the deist. Okay, so it's an intellectual argument, not necessarily a faith-based argument. Saying it's necessary. It's like, well, we have all these natural laws. And something had to have put them in motion. Now it's different from the monotheism, because in monotheism you have a more involved, immanent God than you do in deism.